Welcome to the Savvy Commercial Real Estate Podcast, your resource for relevant, helpful, and immediately usable information regarding all things commercial real estate. Whether you are buying, selling, financing, exchanging, managing, or developing commercial real estate, rest assured you are in the right place. Savvy Commercial. Listen, apply, repeat.
Good morning, everyone. We're back today with the Savvy Commercial Real Estate Podcast. Today, my guest is Frank Rolfe. Frank is renowned all over the country for his knowledge of mobile home and RV parks. His entire business is devoted to mobile home parks and RV parks, and I thought he'd be a perfect guest for our Savvy Commercial Podcast today. Today we're going to be talking, of course, about mobile home parks and RV parks, which have been exceptionally hot over the past few years, but which unfortunately our average real estate investor probably doesn't understand very well. That's where Frank comes in. As a highly experienced investor, a trusted advisor, and an owner-operator of both property types, I'm really hoping Frank's going to shed some light on these particular assets for our listeners around the country. Frank, good morning.
Hey, hi Neil. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Frank. I told a little bit about you and your business in the bio, or in the intro, I should say. But can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your company, and how you got involved in mobile home parks and RV parks in the first place?
Sure, Neil. Excuse me. I started buying up mobile home park and slash RV parks back in 1996. My first property was called Glen Haven. It was kind of a dumpy property that I turned around. And then I just kept repeating that. Today, myself and my partner, Dave Reynolds, were ranked in the top 10 largest owners of mobile home and RV parks in the U.S. We are in about 25 states. We have about 17,000 plus lots. But we started off just with one park each. So we one of the few groups out there that it's our size. It was built organically from scratch.
Wow, that's a ton of growth. And again, did you say 1996? Did I get that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Wow, that's a ton of spaces in that much time. Frank, before we get much further, I do have one question that's been kind of eating at me while we got prepared for this podcast today. Why do some people refer to these as mobile home parks and others refer to them as trailer parks? When somebody says trailer parks, are they in fact talking about the same thing, mobile home parks, or is that a different property type?
Well, it's really strange, Neil, because when the industry began, let me give you a quick history because people have got it all backwards.
Okay.
So when they brought out the automobile, back when people first started doing trips in cars, they didn't have any roadside motels. So those roadside motels, they didn't pop up till, Howard Johnson's and mostly 1950s, 1960s. But back in the 30s and 40s, all the hotels were near train stations. So if you were driving on a cross-country drive in your car, when it got dark out, you either had to pull over and sleep in a tent on the ground, or if you were wealthier, you would have a trailer you'd pull behind the car. So you could go in and sleep in an actual bed and have all the comforts of home pulled behind your car. And a lot of cities saw that rich people had trailers and poor people did not. And they wanted to attract the rich people to stay in their town. So they would start building what are called trailer parks, which was a parking lot for rich people who had trailers. And if you look at the pictures from 30s and the 40s, cities that had done this, they were very proud. They put the name of their city and then the word trailer park underneath it. And it was like a private airport. So the word trailer park, today, people assume when you say trailer park, you're insulting someone. Originally, when you said it, you were complimenting someone. But what happened was the industry had a couple big moments, big shifts in its history. You started off with the whole trailer park concept, and the trailer park was for either RV or mobile home, because back when the word surfaced, they were all one animal. They were not separated. Then over time, they figured out you could build structures that could travel on the highway with a special use permit, built bigger than an RV. So if you planned on living in your RV permanently in one spot, you would no longer get an RV. You would get what then became known as the mobile home. And the mobile home
Sure.
name separated you from RV because it meant you were bigger, longer, wider, and not meant to be transported. And that's how things sat until 1976. And then in 1976, the industry tried to change the name again to manufactured home because in 76, HUD took over all mobile home manufacturing oversight. And therefore, the name was shifted again as a marketing tool, and a very poor marketing tool because no one really likes the name manufactured home. That's kind of insulting. Who wants to be in a manufactured home eating your manufactured sandwich and next to your manufactured car? It's not a very good name. So, but where it all fell apart is the American consumer did not adopt the name manufactured home. They never have. So if you look at Google search utilization, you'll see mobile home represents about 95% of all searches for the industry. And the remaining 5% is split between mostly trailer park and a tiny fraction of manufactured home. So that's why you have this big name problem. So when I talk mobile home park, I'm talking the same thing your audience is thinking of, which is a parking lot filled with these structures, which we all know what a mobile home is. But that's why there's these different naming conventions. They all
Sure.
represented a different part in time. But really, all of us, ourselves included, we use mobile home and mobile home park because that's the name that all Americans know it by.
Got it. Got it. Well, I now know more about the name trailer parks, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are feeling the same way. Frank, let's jump into kind of the weeds, the mechanics, if you will, and the math of mobile home parks and RV parks. When it comes to investing in those two asset classes, can you tell us some of the main differences between that and, say, buying a retail center, a strip center, an apartment complex, an office building, something like that?
Sure. And let me start off with the mobile home park variant, although it has some similarities with RV. When people invest in mobile home parks, the big attraction is the giant moat. The thing that Warren Buffett talks about all the time, which is the big moat that protects your investment from competition. And mobile home parks have two giant moats. One giant moat is that cities don't allow them to be built, and they haven't allowed them to be built since the 1970s. So for 50 years, there's been more mobile home parks torn down each year than are built new. So as a result, we're an endangered species. So you don't have to worry about competition. If you buy a mobile home park, you don't have to worry about someone building a new one across the street from you. So that's a huge item.
Sure.
It also always makes supply and demand in our favor because as cities grow and populations grow, mobile home parks don't grow. So we always have greater demand just by being there because you can't build anymore. Another mode is the affordable housing mode. Our product is by far the cheapest in the U.S., and that didn't mean much to anyone until recently. Back when America was prosperous, mobile home parks were some consider them obsolete. They thought everyone would end up living in a nice brick subdivision. If you look back at how things were under Reagan and then even later under Clinton, when we had a federal surplus, not a deficit, people thought that Americans wouldn't need mobile home parks eventually, that we'd all be rich enough that wouldn't need it. And then, of course, as you know, the America's just careened off that into oblivion. So now affordable housing is hot and nobody else can supply detached affordable housing. It doesn't exist. So in a world where houses are, the average sales nearly 400 grand and the average apartment is nearly 2 grand a month, we look ridiculously cheap.
Sure.
And so that's another key item. It makes our phone ring a lot. The final mode is the fact that the customers can't really afford to ever leave. And I get criticized for talking about that, but it's just a fact. Mobile homes are extremely expensive, if not impossible to move. They were never designed to be moved. They were designed to be moved one time only, and that was from the factory to wherever their destination was, not meant to be removed. So basically, homes from the 70s and the 80s physically could not be transported, probably. Even in the 90s, it's questionable if you can transport it, but even if you wanted to, it's about $5,000 or $10,000 to do it. So when you add it all together, we have some really attractive moats for investors. Another item that is a real attraction is we have very, very high yields. Most people don't get in the mobile home park business unless they think they can make at least somewhere in the mid-teens as total return. And that's not true of all other real estate classes. And then
Sure.
the big one right now, of course, compared to a retail center, is retail and office. They all suffer from weakening, softening in demand. Our demand just keeps growing exponentially, and that's just because Americans just cannot afford the other housing options.
Gosh, I
So
can
I'd say
imagine
those
in
are
the
probably the
last,
big ones.
yeah, I can imagine in the last 5, 6, 7 years, the demand for spaces in mobile home parks has just gone through the roof. Not
It
everyone can
has.
afford apartment rents. Not everyone can afford single family rents, and they need a place to live. So, gosh, that seems like I'm guessing that your business has just taken off. Not that it wasn't
Correct.
before the last run up, but this last run up must have helped you guys quite a bit. I'm imagining.
Yeah, it's kind of strange, Neil, but our highest sales we've ever recorded started in with COVID. So
Sure.
our big bump came in 20, then we had a banner year in 21, an even bigger banner year in 22. And some would say, oh, well, that's just people seeking having their own yard and space from the neighbors. But no, as we all know, prices on almost everything jumped up during that period. I mean, I still have heart failure when I go and gas up my car. I still have heart failure when I go to the store to buy groceries. And all Americans are feeling that. So that's all yielding even more demand for affordable housing. And I don't think that cycle will really ever end. But
Sure.
you're correct. It's the biggest level of demand we've seen in the industry. The first round was the 2007 2008 Great Recession. That was a huge boon to the industry. And then recently, COVID has been an even bigger improvement.
Absolutely. Frank, let's talk about depreciation just for a moment because as I sit and think about it, if an investor acquires, I'll just pick one, I don't know, an office building. Let's pick an apartment building in this case. If an investor buys an apartment building, they can't depreciate the land. Coming up in the industry, I was always told, if you don't have the exact numbers, use 70/30. But let's just say the majority of an apartment complex or a shopping center, office building, whatever, is going to be depreciable after you back out the amount of the land, the percentage of land. With a mobile home park, I realize that you sometimes have park owned models and park owned homes and things like that. But if you don't have those and you have the spaces, can you still take some depreciation because you do have pads, you do have utilities, you do have a clubhouse, you do have other facilities, amenities, if you want to call them that, but you don't always have the bricks and mortar above the ground. How does it work with depreciation? Are you impacted by that in a negative way, or do you just find other things to depreciate with a mobile home or RV park?
Sure, Neil. And again, I'm not a CPA, not trained in accounting. Don't do any of my own CPA or accounting work. Hire that to professionals. But in general, what happens in the mobile home park is typically it's 25% of the value goes to the land and 75% to improvements. And if you actually look at mobile home parks, if you actually take them apart, take like a drawing of how a mobile home lot is built, and you take out the components and the value, that's pretty accurate. It's typically it's about $20,000 a space to build a mobile home lot, and the land component of that is roughly about 25%, or even maybe a little less. So what happens is you can depreciate about 75% of it. The homes themselves can also, if you have any park owned homes, those can also be depreciated. They have their own depreciation amortization. The big effect to most mobile home park buyers is you have normally just about enough depreciation to offset your principal payment on the mortgage. So that theoretically, while you're paying down your debt, you're not having to come out of pocket for what I call phantom income, or income you don't get from the project. That's probably about the best depreciation will do for you in the mobile home park business.
Interesting. Okay, great. Thank you, Frank. Going to the next topic. Let's talk about such things as utilities, water, sewer, trash, electric, gas, and so on. Who's typically responsible for those in a mobile home park?
Well, let's just break them down piece by piece. So on the water system, you typically either have a water well or city water. And if it's city water, then the park owner can either pay the bill for the whole park and give it to the tenant for free, or they can try and bill it back using rubs or cams or separate metered use. So that's kind of how water works. On the and let's just break that down. So everything I just mentioned, obviously, water well is always paid by the park owner, and then if it's municipal water, that might be paid by the park owner or might be passed back to the tenants.
And that's
On the sewer
sewer and trash.
side,
Oh no, I'm sorry.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I was asking if that
Yeah,
included sewer and trash, but go ahead.
yeah, no. On the sewer side, you can have city sewer, and if you have city sewer, which means you probably have city water, I would say most mobile home park owners today then bill that back either through meters or rubs or cams. And then you have all kinds of private sewer in mobile home park. You've got septic, you've got packaging plant, you've got lagoon. Those are the three basic privates. And in all three cases there, the park owner would be paying for it. On electricity, most mobile home parks are separately metered by the power company who bills the customer direct. There are, however, back in the 1950s and 60s, certain parks that have what are called master metered electric, where the park owner pays it. And I've never seen one in which the park owner does not bill that back to the tenant via a meter, because in many cases the power would be more than the lot rent. On the gas side, typically you've got natural gas, almost always billed by the gas company directly to the consumer. But again, there are master metered gas parks floating around out there where the park owner would have to be in charge of the gas, and then they could either bill it back or pay the bill. Then you have propane. Propane is always paid by the park resident. Trash is probably a toss up. It's mostly probably paid by the park owner, but in certain more sophisticated owners, it's paid by the tenant. But that's kind of your basic utilities.
Sure. Okay. Great. I appreciate that. I was always wondering how that worked. So, Frank, kind of an add-on maybe to the last question. Let's talk about the annual overhead or the operating expenses associated with the mobile home park and RV park. Are those operating expenses typically lower than other commercial properties like apartment buildings, office buildings, shopping centers, that kind of thing?
Well, the problem you have with expense ratios, it's a function of rent, right? So on a modern apartment where the rents are $2,000 a month and a mobile home park lot rent in the U.S. averages about $300 a month, then the apartment could have far more expense, but still as a ratio seem lower. Our standard ratio in the industry is 30 to 40% is our normal expense ratio. 30% if the tenant pays their own utilities, and then 40% if the park pays it. RV parks have a little higher expense ratio typically. They run anywhere from about 40 to 50 based on the asset, how it's being managed. But that's kind of where you're at. So if you're looking at a mobile home park deal, you're probably looking at about 30 to 40% expense ratio. If you flip that to an RV park, you're probably looking 40 to 50%.
Okay, thank you. Frank, we touched on this a little earlier, but I'd like to go just a little bit deeper here with regard to the ongoing housing crisis. You know, you can't look at any industry paper at all. I don't care if it's your local paper, Wall Street Journal, your online news feeds, and so on, without seeing something to do with the housing crisis. And it's, worse depending on what part of the country you are. Or at least they have you believing it's worse depending on what part of the country you're in. So from an affordability standpoint, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier. Have you experienced a positive impact on both your occupancy rates and rental rates over the last few years as a direct result of the housing crisis, I should say, the ongoing housing crisis? And also, do you expect that to continue for a while?
Well, again, housing crisis plays right into our strong suit, right? Because we are the Dollar Tree of housing. So as prices go up, the demand for the Dollar Tree goes up. We're no different. So yeah, everything you just mentioned, all of those things have resulted in the highest levels of demand for our product that the industry has ever seen. So in many of our properties, we get up to 100 calls a week from people looking for a space, yet we're full. And so it's a chronic problem. I think most bureaucrats don't appreciate it because they don't exist in that world. So they look at realtor.com at houses that start at $500,000 and up, and they say, oh, there's plentiful product and everything seems to be in balance. They have no idea what's really going on with those folks who are in basically the bottom third of income, who are struggling to find any possible affordable option. And so there's kind of this disconnect between, I think, the government and the affordable housing industry. Even what people consider affordable housing, no one understands, I think, very well. To us, affordable housing would represent being able to pay your housing cost at about a third of your income. And if you look at people who make about $30,000 a year, which is 20% of the U.S. population, make only $30,000 household income, then what's that leave you? Well, if you take a third of 30,000, 10,000, you'd have $800 a month of total housing cost. That is less than half of the average apartment. That is less than half of the average single family home rental. So basically, it's a huge problem. People always just think of that higher half of the U.S. population, I think, because they make more political donations and have more disposable income to buy products. But the housing crisis is way worse than anyone has a clue of. It's never made it into the media. There's no real C-SPAN discussions of affordable housing, but it's gonna pop up at some point in a big way, because there's no way the average American who works in normal jobs like Taco Bell or the brake shop, they can possibly participate in the U.S. housing market.
Sure.
And it's a huge problem, way outstrips anything that we do.
Sure, understood. Frank, at this point, we're probably at the halfway mark, maybe even a little bit more. And I'd like to take just a quick break here to ask you if any of our listeners want to go to your website, learn more about mobile home park and RV park investing. Can you just tell us a little bit about how to get a hold of you, or give us the website location, or anything you could tell us about your company for people listening to be able to find you later?
Sure. Neil, back just probably about 2005-ish, my partner Dave and I decided, because the industry at that time had absolutely no advocacy at all, that it would be beneficial if we started to educate people on how the industry worked, because it would filter down to lenders, appraisers, and everybody. So that's kind of been the mission. So back then we started a website, and all of my writings, I have thousands of hours of videos and articles. It's an insane amount of stuff. If you just go to the website called www.mhu.com, which stands for Mobile Home University, you'll find a repository of everything I've ever written and done, and you'll find my phone number on there, my contact, everything on there. If you just go to MHU, which stands for mobilehomeuniversity.com.
Perfect. And I've been on that site, I believe, but can you remind me, in addition to the thousands of hours of content and so on, are there things that they can subscribe to? Can they subscribe to emails
Yes.
from you, or other content?
Yes, all kinds of stuff. If you just look through I'm a very low tech person, but at the top of the page when you go to it, you'll see everything is very organized. We have everything from all the articles in there to we have books, courses, anything and everything based on the science of mobile home park investing.
Perfect. Thank you and that's nice and easy. That's easier than I thought. MHU.com, www.mhu.com. Perfect. So, Frank, getting back to the topic at hand, let's talk about, I guess, either geography or demography or demographics. Are there certain parts of the country, either right now, in the past, in the future, where an investor can acquire a mobile home park, an RV park, and do better today, given the current state of the economy or the current state of the housing crisis, than they might do in other parts of the country? And if so, can you tell us maybe a few of the hot spots and maybe some of the not so hot spots?
Sure. Well, the first thing you have to acknowledge in our industry, since these haven't been built in half a century, is you're stuck with however many there are in every state. And some states don't have hardly any. So the top states, as far as actual number of mobile home parks in the state, number one is Texas. Number two and number three are a toss-up between California and Florida. Number four is Kentucky, of all places. And then on the flip side, places where you have very few are places like Vermont, New Hampshire. And then you might say, well, why is that? Why do some parts of America have a lot of parks and some parts have no parks? Part of it is that the industry is relatively new. It didn't come into being in a big way till the 50s and the 60s. So, in other parts of the Northeast, which date to the 1700s, they were developed way before we ever came on the scene. The other issue is that mobile home parks, most of the growth of the industry was tied to the military, because the military were huge advocates of mobile homes, and ultimately mobile home parks. So during the World War II, the government bought 500,000 mobile homes. They then relocated those as part of the GI Bill to colleges. So if you look at the states with the most parks, it's also the states that had the most military bases and or colleges during that little period of time. And so the first answer to the question is, the most fertile markets are ones that have a decent supply of parks, which means New England is kind of out of the middle. Then the next part of it is that, we've learned by doing this for, over 25 years and owning things in 25 states. We own stuff in half the country that, the U.S. is not like a big unified country. It's more like Europe. Each state is like its own country, right? Even if you look at Europe, our average states are about the same size as the countries, right? So, California could be France, and, Texas could be, I don't know what, England, whatever. So you have to look at them all individually. Some have big pluses and some minuses. Some have big pluses and no minuses, and some have a whole bunch of minuses without any pluses. If you look at California as an example, the laws are terrible. The political atmosphere is terrible, but you get enormous lot rents. In California, a $2,000 a month lot rent is considered common. It's not unique.
Wow.
Right? So that helps offset the discomfort of the political situation. Then you look at a state such as Mississippi. Well, there's hardly any rules in Mississippi, but the lot rents are only about $100 a month. So we like to be in areas that are somewhere in the middle between all that. So our holdings are mostly in the Great Plains and the Midwest. We like those regions a whole lot. We also think the Southeast is really very much up and coming right now, particularly the state of Alabama, because the South has realized how to get back in the game now, and they are heavily promoting themselves for automobile manufacturing, things like that. Really, all regions have performed well historically, but our personal preference is the Great Plains and the Midwest, which is kind of in the middle of America, because that way we get higher rents without a lot of the political downside to it all.
Sure.
But there really is no area to avoid. I mean, the only state that has no parks is Hawaii. But I would say if you were to cut off the areas with the least opportunity, obviously Hawaii, and then probably the New England area.
Okay, New England area. Okay, I'm just taking some notes. So, kind of related to that last question, when you say that there's been really no new park construction over the last 40 or 50 years. But you could still buy, if you moved into a mobile home park, can you still buy a new mobile home from one of the companies that makes these? Couldn't you get a brand new one with all the bells and whistles versus your neighbors, which might be 30 or 40 years old?
Okay, you're saying, help me on the question. You're saying, can you buy a new mobile home?
Yeah, so
saying
you're moving into a park that you're saying might have been built 30, 40, 50 years
ago.
Oh,
okay. Now,
but you can buy a brand new home,
right? You're talking you as the customer, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, as the customer, if I were to move into a mobile home park, even though it might have been built 30, 40, 50 years ago, can I go and buy a brand new home to live in with all the best upgrades?
Yes.
Okay.
You're right. The way the parks work is they come in three variety: legal conforming, which means the city says you could build it again today; legal non-conforming, which means grandfathered; and then illegal. So illegal, you can't bring any homes in because you're not supposed to exist. If you're legal non-conforming, it means you're grandfathered as a parking lot. So like a parking lot, you can come in and park any kind of car, and in this case, any kind of mobile home that you like. Normally today, when people are buying mobile homes to move into parks, even if they're buying in the used market, they're typically talking 1990s and newer. Those are the standard. And yes, most people who move into parks today, and most park owners who fill their own vacant lots, they're buying new inventory, so they're buying homes that are typically as much as 50 years newer than the park itself. And if you look at a lot of parks and you say, when was this park built? And it might be 1950, 1960, but it looks like it was built yesterday because over the last half century, they've repopulated it with all new homes. And then often they've gone in and ripped out and replaced the water lines and the sewer lines with modern ones. So yes, these things just keep getting recycled is how it works.
And
So they
go
just like
ahead.
a house that gets remodeled.
Sure. And when you spoke earlier about how hard it would be to pick one of these things up and move it, when you go into the nicer parks, or at least the ones with the newer models in there, um, they're not typically on blocks or something. Those things are in, they're like homes. They're in the ground. They've got the skirting. They've got the gardens. I mean, if you didn't, some of these things, if you didn't know it was a mobile home, you wouldn't know. It looks like a house. I mean,
Yeah.
that's in there. They've made a commitment. So that brings me to this next question, because I know, at least where I am, you've seen a lot of mobile home parks bought for redevelopment into things like, let's just say apartment complexes, assisted living, whatever, typically residential, because the location is so good. But some of these people, like I said, they've invested a ton of money. They're dug in, so to speak. You can't just put a notice on their door and say, we bought the property, you've got to move. Don't these people have leases? And I would imagine they're probably a little bit longer term than, say, your typical apartment lease.
Neil, actually, it's the reverse. If you Google up news stories on mobile home parks, you'll see the two most common news stories are people complaining about increasing rents and people complaining about parks being shut down, not realizing the two go hand in hand.
Sure.
So if you stop people raising rent, then clearly they're going to redevelop. And so a lot of parks get redeveloped every year. And one wrinkle that people do not realize because they're not in the industry, but it's easy to figure out, is that a mobile home park is very easy to redevelop because typically they've got really good frontage because most parks were built back in the 50s and the 60s and the cities grew around them. So, the nothing road of 1960 is now the main drag. The size of the pad, for a Home Depot or an apartment complex is very attractive. Most mobile home parks are just the right size. We're just the right size for everything from fast food to big box retail. But the big one is cities hate parks, right? There's no city in America that likes their mobile home park. They all wish they'd go away because they cost the city a ton of money. So what happens is when someone wants to redevelop a mobile home park, the city will give you almost any zoning you want to get it redeveloped if you promise to tear the thing down. And the leases on parks traditionally are month to month. And some states are not allowed to go month to month. Like many of the blue states, you have to give people at least a 1 year term. But even then, at the time someone goes to redevelop, some of those leases might only have a month left. Some might only have a few months. And in most states, although you give the residents X number of days advance notice, it doesn't really cure the problem that their home really is not transportable and the fact that it costs a lot to transport. Now, California has tried to lead the charge in trying to solve this, but their stuff doesn't make any sense either. They often spend $60,000 to $100,000 a customer with all of their crazy stuff they do. Those customers would be better served just giving them a check for $100,000 and letting them move to the Midwest and buy a house.
Sure.
So I don't know how you really solve that issue. That it is near hard to impossible to move the mobile homes. And yes, if the park gets redeveloped, you give due notice. In some states, you have to give the resident first option to try and buy the park, which they never successfully do. So rarely, it's not even worth mentioning. And then yes, they typically they'll be out of that park within, I would say, typically 1 year or less, and typically only a matter of months. Even the government itself. See, what's so hypocritical is the government shut down a park in Yellowstone. Recently, there was a park that Yellowstone had built back in the day for, I guess, people who worked in and around Yellowstone who had no money. It was on government land, and they just shut it down. And they gave the people virtually no notice.
I
They
read
gave
about
them
that.
60 days notice. And so, it's just a fact of life. This is private property, and you have the right to do whatever you want to do in line with the law.
Sure.
And there's really no way to solve. You can't mandate to someone to move something which is not movable. It is impossible.
The problem, but you already know this, but the problem with putting a notice on the door of a 60, 70, or 80-year-old person who's lived there for 30 years, where the heck are they going to go, especially today? They might be paying next to nothing, relatively speaking. They might be paying, I don't know, $300-400. I don't know if there's such a thing as rent control, but in these parks, but they might be paying a low pad rent, or even if they're paying a higher pad rent, their home's probably paid off by then. Now you put a notice on their door and they have to move. Where the heck can they go, especially at that age, where they're going to pay anything close to that? Their cost of occupancy, whether it's buying, renting, whatever, has to double, if not triple.
Yeah.
My heart goes out to these people. I understand progress. I understand you can't stand in the way of progress and all that. But, you displace 30, 40, or 100 people who have been there for 30 years. Where the heck are they going to go? They might have to move in with their kids or something.
Yeah, Neil, the you're exactly correct. And that is why it's odd to me that the government has not attempted to do more to embrace keeping parks as mobile home parks. I mean, there's a guy, I don't agree with his political views, but Keith Ellison, I think he's out of Minnesota, he introduced a bill in Congress that would give mobile home park owners a tax incentive to stay as a mobile home park. If you sold, I think under his proposal, if you sold your mobile home park to someone and they kept it a mobile home park, then you basically paid no income tax on it.
Wow.
They need to come up with, instead of trying to berate park owners, they need to figure out more the carrot than the stick on this type of thing. HUD has not approached the industry in a positive form ever. The while back, 15 years ago, someone had the right idea, which was, why not let people use HUD vouchers to buy mobile homes? Because at a certain point, then the home would be paid off, and then the HUD would only have to pay the lot rent. It made complete sense. It passed in Congress, but then HUD refused to enact it. They said that it was optional, and no office, to our knowledge, ever took the option on it. So we're very unappreciated on that front, because, yes, the government could do a lot more to try and stem parks being redeveloped. You're not going to be able to stop parks from having the option to be redeveloped. That's property rights. You're not going to be able to stop progress, that there are better uses for a lot of these parks. But you could try and greenmail people into maintaining them as parks.
Sure.
And since everyone is just hell-bent on publicly shaming park owners constantly on raising rents, they're creating the parks being torn down. Yet few people realize that.
Yeah, that's a sad state of affairs. Frank, I'm looking, and I only have just a few more questions for you. So can you
Sure.
share with our listeners a little bit about how you underwrite each of these properties to arrive at a price to offer the seller or the owner? My question is I'm trying to figure out if these are traded on a cap rate basis, a cash-on-cash return basis, or something else entirely.
Yeah, well, our industry and all industries are at the end of the day tied to math, right? It's an investment. You're trying to get a rate of return. The problem with the mobile home park industry is it's not quite as simple as the more sophisticated owners of apartments and office buildings and retail centers. Because when we buy mobile home parks from moms and pops, they're typically broken. And we have to figure out what is the potential when we fix it. And then how much of that potential are we going to stick into our underwriting of the property? I'll give you an example. We bought a mobile home park down in Austin. It was on the west side of the interstate. The lot rent was $300, $350 a month. The park on the east side, which was identical, the lot rent was almost $600 a month. So how do you underwrite that? Do you underwrite that as a 350 lot rent? Or do you say, well, upon buying it, I'll immediately raise the rent, $100 to 450. So do I underwrite it based on 450, which would be the first rent increase after, say, 90 days? Or do I say, well, but then again, the next year I'm going to raise it up another $100? That's the kind of stuff we're faced with constantly. I mean, we've seen cases where moms and pops have $5,000 a month of water leaks. So at a $5,000 a month water leak, that means there's $1 million they're leaving on the table because they never fixed the leaks because they either didn't have the know-how or didn't care to do it. So we have to then evaluate, okay, so of that 5,000, we go out in diligence and we figure out, there's a water leak. Can you fix it? Well, we think so. We know where the leak is. We can dig it up at closing and fix it. Then how much of that do you calculate in? And the problem is it's not just you as the buyer. The other issue is how much will the banker and the appraiser use of that potential. So that's how underwriting gets very, very tricky. We ourselves have bought mobile home parks. A classic example, we bought a mobile home park in Illinois that was offered at a negative cap rate. It was a large park that was losing almost $40,000 a year through horrific mismanagement. It had $250,000 a year of payroll in a 100 space occupied park. Typical payroll on that park would have been 30,000.
Wow.
So there was over 200,000 to cut just in payroll. So that park, we bought it at a negative cap, and in the very first year, cut everything, fixed everything. We ended up at a 20% return at the end of year one. So we flipped from a negative to up 20 on the cap. So that's what makes the industry. That's where the art form comes in, because most of our stuff, you're looking at not what it is now. You always know it's screwed up now. The question is, what could it be? And then how much of that can I stick into my numbers? And then additionally, I may still be wrong because the bank and the appraiser may come up with a different set of numbers. So that's Frank, what makes it so complicated.
But Frank, generally speaking, I hear you talking about what you can do to the property, and I get that. If it has a value add component or several value add components, that's attractive. But how much of that are you willing to pay the seller? I mean, are you paying the seller for something that they can't accomplish and haven't been able to accomplish? Should they essentially be getting tomorrow's price today, or are you trying? I'm assuming you're trying to buy the property based on the income that's there now and knowing what you can do to do with it and to it, I guess, after you acquire it, right? You're not going to give too much of that upside to the seller, correct? I mean, they couldn't do it.
Well, sure. Here's the problem. In other words, most of these sellers, at the end of the day, have a price that they will not budge from. And so you can do your underwriting and you can say, well, based on what it is right now, here's the price that works. And some of them may agree to that, but most of them will not. Most will say, no, I got to get more than that. And then you have to either walk the deal or bridge the gap.
Sure.
And so when we're trying to bridge the gap, we're looking at all the different options to improve the net income and trying to do an algorithm in our own brain of what's the likelihood we can get this done. What's the worst case? If we think we can raise the rent by X, let's use half X. If we think we can fill 10 more lots, let's model it that we only fill 2, things like that.
Okay.
But many of these park owners, because our industry is so very weird, there's so few transactions, they come up with prices often that aren't based on net income at all. Like a very common thing when you ask a park owner, do you want to sell? The number they love to hear, which I'm sure is true in all properties, $1 million. Everyone loves the concept of $1 million. Some of them, when they throw out the $1 million, the thing is worth $2 million. So that's fantastic. But some, the price of the park, the value is only maybe $500,000 in its current state, yet they want $1 million. Because bear in mind, most of our sellers are not sophisticated. Like When you say, what cap rate is that? They don't even know what a cap rate is.
Okay.
They have absolutely no clue. When you get a broker involved in the thing, it gets much better because the broker educates the seller and says, no, seller, you can't get $1 million. This is your net income. This is a cap rate. And they say, well, I don't like that number. And they say, well, but the guy will not be able to get a loan more than that because that's what it will appraise at. So the sellers dispense a lot of good and valuable knowledge to the moms and pops. But often when we're buying these parks, we're buying them directly from moms and pops without the assistance of a broker, the existence of a broker. And that makes it harder because then they don't have any idea. We're trying to educate them just literally on their asset and how the numbers work.
Sure.
That's why it's so incredibly funky.
Well, Frank, you mentioned lenders and appraisers. I wrote that down, lenders and appraisers, which kind of segues into my next question, which is about financing. Are conventional lenders, standing at the ready, happily willing to finance these property types? Is that an issue? Meaning have some lenders, I don't want to use the word redlined, I think that's probably a little harsh, but have some lenders made a decision they're not going to loan on mobile home parks? I'm just wondering how that affects the liquidity, not just going in, but frankly, when you go to sell it. And I guess the last component of that would be, would seller financing, I assume seller financing would kind of remedy that problem in all cases. If you can get the seller to finance it for you, you don't have to go to conventional lenders, especially if you get that seller to carry for, I don't know, 5 or 10 years. Can you comment on financing a little bit?
Sure. No, that's been one of the biggest changes in the industry since I got in it and my partner Dave got in it. When I got in it in the 90s, if you wanted a loan on a mobile home park, forget it. Nobody did them in the 90s because all the parks back in the 90s looked pretty bad, and there was no one you can point to that was respectable in the industry. And then that all changed also in the mid 90s when Sam Zell started buying into the industry.
Sure.
So Zell is now the largest owner of mobile home parks in America. And when he jumped in it, all the lenders suddenly said, wait a minute, maybe this stuff isn't that bad. So today, now 25 years later than when Sam Zell, or 20, almost 30 years from Sam Zell got in the business, lenders love mobile home parks. So getting loans today on mobile home parks is probably the easiest part of the business. You can get bank debt, conduit debt, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Everyone does them. Why? Because they have very low default rates. In fact, we have probably the lowest default rate. Typically every year we win or storage wins, but recently, because storage may be overbuilt, I think we're winning the lowest default rate. So that's the bright spot. I've never in the last 10 years, I've not seen a deal die in financing.
Are you seeing?
That's not the way it goes anymore. Now, did it at one time? Yes, it totally did. If you look back in the 90s, getting a loan was the hardest thing on the planet Earth. But today, lending is probably the easiest the industry has ever seen.
I didn't mean to step on you back there, but I was going to ask about things like, well, you're saying it's easy to get, which is phenomenal. It's great to hear. But what about things like, loan to value or debt service coverage ratios? Because it's a mobile home park, I'm not taking anything away from a mobile home park, but because the homes, typically most of them, except for the park-owned models, belong to someone else. Are they making these loans based on income streams? Are they making it based on the land value? Some combination? Are loan to value ratios lower on a mobile home park than they might be on some other asset class? Can you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. We heard about based on the lender, somewhere between a 70 and 80% LTV.
Okay.
So pretty much in line with all the other real estate sectors. When the lenders look at this stuff, obviously the income is the big driver on value, but they look at the other options too, like replacement cost and everything else. But you're correct. We are a parking lot. So our nearest relative in the real estate food chain is in fact a parking lot out at the airport, downtown, wherever it might be. We are in the same business as them. That's where the word park and mobile home park comes from. It's not like national park, natural park, parkland. No, it's parking lot.
Sure.
And so we are evaluated very similar to that. So, a parking lot in a downtown area, people look at the land and say, well, it could be built into a building, an office building someday, maybe. That's some component of value. But the big real component is income, because at the end of the day, we're just a parking lot.
Okay, great. Listen, I'm down to my last two questions. The first of those two is going to be pretty easy. We've talked a little bit about this already. If you take your typical mobile home park resident and compare it to, I don't know, let's say I think maybe an apartment complex rather than a shopping center or an office building that might have a long-term lease. So let's make it residential to residential. How long do how long do they typically stay at a mobile home park versus an apartment complex, and I realize that the recent run up in single family home prices have maybe had a little impact. People aren't moving as much today, but if you maybe discount the last 4 years a little bit, because that's that kind of skews the numbers. Typically speaking, how long does someone stay at a mobile home park or a trailer park versus, say, an apartment complex?
Neil, our industry is strange because nobody actually tracks our data, but the general consensus is 14 years. That's the number one most commonly used response to the question: is the average tenant lasts for 14 years? But is there any science behind that? No, probably not. Other people say a decade. So I'm going to say somewhere a decade plus is typical tendency. And that pretty much is in line with what we've observed. You have some residents who move in 1970 and live there until their death. And so they're there for 50 years.
Sure.
And then you have other residents who move in with the best of intentions, get divorced a year later, and move out. So, but when you average all those together, I would think that a decade plus is probably a pretty safe guess on that.
Okay. And Frank, we're down to my last question for you, and this is really more of a personal question to you and your company, your business model, and so on. Are you and your team only looking for value-add opportunities, as you mentioned earlier, where you can buy it at X and do certain things and then it's worth Y, or you sell it for Y? Or will you also look at what I would call, for lack of a better word, a turnkey property where maybe it doesn't have $5,000 a month of water leaks. It doesn't have a huge amount of upside today because the party you're buying it from has pretty much done that, or most of it. Will you buy a park like that because it's kind of a turnkey, kind of a core asset where you're not going to do a lot to it in terms of putting money into it and repositioning it, but you're gonna maybe tweak it a little bit over the years and just settle for a nice turnkey property?
Yeah, see, Neil, in our industry, many of the parks that we buy, the only thing broken on the park is the rent level. So our entire plan is nothing more than to raise rents. We've bought parks that are fully occupied before. They don't have any water leaks. They look perfectly, but the lot rents are hugely below market. And so in that regard, every park that we buy and every park that pretty much anyone buys, even these big private equity groups such as Carlyle and Apollo and Blackstone that have now started buying up mobile home parks, we are all chasing the same item, which is that these parks are hugely undervalued on a rent level. And if you actually look on parks that people buy and later sell, and you say, okay, what was the key component to that profit? It's always been raising rents. Everything else is a one-time shot. If you fix up a water leak, it's one-time shot. Fill a vacant lot, one-time shot. Fill a vacant home, one-time shot. Replace the manager, one-time shot. But raising rents is something that is ongoing, and the industry has never come to terms with how high rents can still be affordable, and still maintain full occupancy. I'll give you a couple examples. If you go out to the parks in Southern California, any old mobile home park in the LA area, the lot rent today is probably around $1,500 a month, right? And they're completely full. You go to the park in Malibu, the lot rent is almost $3,000 a month. It's completely full. And you might say, well, that's California. That's just an anomaly. Well, let's go out to the middle of America. Let's go to Denver. Denver lot rents are now at about $900 a month. Those lot rents are only about $300 a month, not that long ago. Those parks in Denver are completely full with waiting lists. So we know that a $900 rent is by no means the limit in Denver. And then the question is, well, if 900 is not the limit in Denver, then does that mean that you can't get $900 in other markets? And the answer is no, you probably can. Dallas Fort Worth rents, for example, they're up now to about $650. They're coming up on $700. Does that mean they can't go more than $700? No, they'll be able to keep marching up. And then if I buy a park in Missouri at a $350 rent, again, how high would I be and to the point where I'm no longer fully occupied? I'm not sure there's a limit. I mean, $700 probably still have a waiting list. So that's the key driver of the industry. That's why everyone buys into it, is the rent level. So when you talk about turnkey property, we buy turnkey properties. Many people do. All the private equity groups mostly do. But the one item that's never really turnkey finished is the rent. And unlike apartments and other things where you kind of are bumping up, there is in fact a ceiling, in which case, occupancy plummets and you can't go any higher. We are so far away from that moment. I don't even know when that will occur. I mean, most park owners try and limit rent increases to $50 once a year. So if you were $500 under market, it would take you 10 years to get there. And 10 years from now, you'd probably have to go another 10 years to get there.
Sure.
So that's kind of how it works.
Just a quick tag on or add on to that last question. After you have finished, not when you buy a property, especially if it's distressed, but after you're done tweaking it a little bit, what should the expectation be in terms of a cash-on-cash return? If you invested $1 million, for example, all in, and now it's quote-unquote stabilized, what should the cash-on-cash return be? Because I'm assuming you're going to hit us with a number that's probably well above what an investor would expect to get from a stabilized strip center or a stabilized office building or a stabilized apartment complex even. This number is going to probably be high, I'm assuming. What should that number be after you're done acquiring it, tweaking it, improving where you can improve, and so on?
Sure. Again, it's a big industry, 44,000 mobile home parks, from fancy to dirt road things down by the river. If you add it all together and you look at everyone out there doing it, I would say most people's expectations are an overall return, cash on cash, of somewhere between 10 and 20% is the norm. Now, there are
Okay.
certain properties out there that can well exceed that. And then there's other properties that you couldn't hit 10 with, particularly out in California where people pay insane prices. I think someone paid almost $250 million for a park
Wow.
in Northern California recently. So, but I would say the normal investor is looking for a return of 10 to 20%. Many of your small investors are looking at more than 20%, or they don't want to get involved with some of those rougher turnaround mobile home parks. But I would say that's pretty much the norm.
And I thought that was going to be my last question, but I'm just going to add one more. If anyone
Yeah.
listening to this wants to, let's say they're not ready to take the plunge on their own and buy their own park and manage it and so on, can they invest side by side with you and your colleagues?
We were one of the first people to do Reg D 506 funds, starting about in 2010. We've done a lot of them. We have 9 of them that we started, bought the properties, managed, and then sold them off. So we have 9 that are closed out. We have 3 that are still in existence but are not open. And then we opened another one recently called Strategic. So yes, there's that option. Now you have to be an accredited investor. You got to read the PPM. There's a minimum amount, all the typical boilerplate. But yes, we have a Reg D mobile home park fund. It's called Strategic MHP Fund.
Got it. Strategic. I'm writing it down. And if they're not an accredited investor, do you have anything for those people?
No, for non-accredited, the best I can do is you can attend one of my workshops on buying a park on your own. But most of the Reg D funds will require an accredited investor, and then of course you don't have to be accredited to buy shares of Sam Zell's ELS or Sun Community or UMH, which are all public REITs. But of course, returns right now are very low. I think they're paying out of like a 2 point something percent dividend, and all REIT stocks have not done the best recently. So, but no, on Reg Ds, you pretty much have to be accredited.
And Frank, one more time, the name of the strategic fund, I think there was a third word in there.
Oh, it's just Strategic MHP Fund.
MHP.
So, which stands for Mobile Home Park Fund.
Sure.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, Frank, thank you very much. It's been an honor to have you on our show today. This is going to be one of the best episodes to date. It is one of the best episodes to date. Very, very enlightening. I mean, look, I've been in this business since the mid-'80s, and I'm taking notes. I've learned so much today that I didn't know before this call started. So I hope that our listeners can say the same after they listen to this. Thank you very much. My guest today has been Frank Rolfe. As he mentioned earlier, if you want to check out his website, it's www.mhu, Mobile Home University, MHU.com. Check it out. He's got tons of content there, thousands of hours of content. You can learn all you need to learn and then some about the mobile home park and RV park industry. Frank Rolfe, again, thank you very much for your time. Take care, and hopefully we'll have you back again soon.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you. Bye-bye.